and there may be some glitches in joining because of the change in the platform, because yesterday there were some problems in sharing the screen, so we changed to Webex platform today, and I hope all of those who wanted to join have been able to join without much difficulty. So now I will start sharing my screen, and I will initiate today's talk. Okay, so I hope you can see my screen. So this is the second talk in this two talk series, and today we will talk about some developments in the code which are relatively recent. The background to these developments we discussed yesterday, and with that background now we can understand that what was the logic behind bringing these changes in the code. So the first thing we are going to discuss is the different types of modeling techniques which are allowed for different types of structures, different types of bridges in the codes. So basically there can be two types of models. Either we can model the piers independently. So in case of regular bridges where the piers are of almost same height and simply supported bridges are there, we can model individual piers also. So here in this slide I show the modeling of a pier. So pier can be either modeled using a single frame element. So in this second middle figure you see this, or I will use the laser pointer. So this element 2 to 3, this is a single frame element, a column element. So pier we can model like a column, and here the whole pier is modeled using one element. So part of the mass of the pier will be lumped at node 2 and part of it will be lumped at pier 3. And then from 1 to 2, this is a rigid element, relatively rigid element, which is representing the pier cap. In this particular figure, the superstructure itself is connected directly to the pier, but normally we will have a pier cap at the top of it. So pier cap is modeled separately with a different element because the cross section here will change significantly, and if we are modeling the pier cap with the actual cross section of the pier, the mass will also be considered by the model automatically. Then here at the bottom we may or may not model the foundation flexibility. So foundation flexibility can be modeled using 3 springs, one in vertical direction, another in horizontal direction, and then a rotational spring. So all the 3 degrees of freedom in a plane will be modeled using this. If we want to model in the longitudinal direction also, then we will give 3 springs in that direction as well. So we will require 6 springs to model the pier in both the directions. Then at the top we see a rigid element which is starting from the middle of the pier cap, and then the first node here is representing the CG of the superstructure. So if we are considering this as the pier cap, then the superstructure will be at a height from the pier cap. So the mass of the superstructure will be acting at its CG, and up till that point we will connect it through a rigid element, and then the live load will be even at higher level, and that will be connected by another rigid element. Now we know in case of bridges the mass of the live load is effective only in the transverse direction, and that too we consider only part of it. In railway code we consider it as 50%, and in highway codes we consider it as 20%. So that 20% mass of the live load, that will be located at this topmost node, and it will be connected with the rigid element to the frame element which we have used to model the pier. Now in this case we cannot consider the variation of the pier cross section if it is taking place along the height like it is shown in this particular case. So if I want to model the change in the cross section, I can divide this frame element into a number of elements. So here we can see that it has been divided into 6-7 elements along the height. Or if the pier is tall, even if its cross section is uniform but the pier is tall, then also we need to model the higher modes, and in that case further subdivision of the pier, mashing of the pier into smaller elements is required, and I should have sufficient number of elements along the height. Usually 10 elements are considered to be adequate. Now what pier or which height of the pier we will say that it is a tall pier, that we will come slightly later when we will talk about the code. And at the top of it again we will model the mass of the superstructure as well as live load. Now coming to the modeling of the foundation, in the previous slide we have modeled foundation using 3 springs. If we have a deep foundation like a well foundation, or we have pile foundation, it may be single monopile or it may have a pile group. In that case piles can be modeled using springs also. So whether it is a bearing pile or it is a friction pile, the tip of the pile we support in the vertical direction. So please see here that the tip is supported in the vertical direction, and horizontally the stiffness of the soil is represented by springs. So we divide again the pile length into sufficient number of elements at different nodes. We assign the springs, and these springs are representing the stiffness of the pile. So we can calculate, we can get the horizontal modulus of subgrade reaction, and that modulus of subgrade we can use to define these springs. So that will take the flexibility of the foundation into account. Now when we are doing simplifications, what simplification we do? We can assume the pier to be fixed at the top of the foundation. So in this simplification we are assuming the pier to be fixed. Now what approximation we are making, what error we are making, that the deformation, which is the displacement which is taking at the top of the pile, that deformation is not simulated here. And 2 types of deformations are there. One is the translation and another is rotation, and both translation and rotations are increasing the displacement at the top of the pier. So because the displacement at the top of the pier increases, the flexibility of the pier increases, or the period of the pier increases. So if we are interested in finding out the forces and we make these simplifications, then in calculation of the forces we are on conservative side. So we can accept this simplification when we are assuming the pier to be fixed at the top of the foundation. So it is alright, it is slightly a conservative side if we are interested in calculating the forces and bending moments. But if I am calculating the displacement, then it is on non-conservative side. The flexibility of the soil, both due to translation and due to rotation, will cause additional displacement. So the displacement will be underestimated. So this we have to keep in mind, that when we are ignoring the foundation flexibility, it is perhaps alright, it is on conservative side for the calculation of the forces, but not for the calculation of displacement. There the foundation flexibility will increase the displacements. Then how to model the superstructure? That was regarding the substructure. In some cases we have to model the superstructure as well. In which cases, when our bridge is continuous, then we need to model the superstructure, because superstructure is distributing the force between different piers. Or if our bridge is of irregular shape, then also we should model the superstructure along with the piers. So the superstructure can be modeled either using finite elements, so we can use shell elements to model the superstructure. We can use grillage, so we are familiar with this approximation, where the deck slab, which is actually a plate element or rather shell type of a structure, but we convert this into an equivalent grid. So that slab, deck slab, we divide into frame elements in both the directions, and we model it as a grillage. So this is one acceptable model for superstructure. And alternatively, we think that the number of degrees of freedom here are becoming too many and it will be difficult, it will take more time. So we can also represent it by equivalent single frame element, which we call as a spine. So this third figure which shows a spine model here. Here the cross-sectional properties, that is the area and moment of inertia about the two axes and the torsional rigidity, we assign to this single element, single frame element, which we call as a spine. and between the spine and the piers, because if I am having two piers like this, so between the piers there will be a spacing. This will be connected through a rigid element. So a rigid element is taken perpendicular to the spine, which will be connecting with the piers. Or if there was another span beyond that, then that will be showing the gap between, and that gap will be modeled by adjacent these transverse rigid elements from both the spans. Okay, another situation where we require this modeling of superstructure is when we have unequal pier heights. For example, in case of hilly terrains, when the bridge is constructed across a deep gorge, then the piers will be of different height, and when the piers are of different height, then the superstructure will undergo rotation, because this end of the superstructure is flexible, the other end is rigid, which is connected to the abutment. So the left end is rigid, the right end is flexible, and as a result the superstructure is going to rotate, and when it is rotating at this location we will get pounding. So one problem is that we get pounding, and other problem is that at the bearings there will also be a rotation, and if we are using more than one pin bearing or guided bearings, then those bearings will be subjected to additional forces because of this rotational or torsional moment which will be generating at this end. So the bearings will be subjected to additional forces. In such cases, it is important that we model the superstructure also and make a 3D model. So that 2D model of single pier, that will not give us this effect, and the forces which we will get will also not be correct in that case. So when we have this type of irregularity either in the height of the piers, or we have the irregularity in the orientation, whether our bridge is askew or curved, like in this case. So if the bridge is askew or curved, then also we need to model the superstructure, because it has been observed that the curved bridge, when it will deform, let us say earthquake force is acting in the upward direction. So when the earthquake force is acting in this direction, the superstructures are going to rotate, and when the superstructures will rotate, again there will be pounding at one end and there will be opening at the other end. And sometimes this rotational motion is so large, it is so intense, that this type of curved spans are thrown away from the substructure, from the piers. So if the bearings are not designed, proper arrangement is not made to hold it down, during earthquake it can be even thrown out. What we see here in this photo, that the curved bridge has been thrown out of alignment, but it is still resting on the pier, but sometimes this can be thrown even away from the piers. That has also been observed in some of the past earthquakes. Then what type of analysis are available and which the code permits? One analysis, the simplest analysis, can be that we can consider this pier as a single degree freedom system. So we know that any single pier we have, or any structure for that matter, not only the bridge structure, other structures as well, can be represented by different modes, or this structure can vibrate in some natural modes, or the response of this structure we can consider as combination of its response in different natural modes. These natural modes are such that all the mass points on the structure are vibrating with the same frequency, and we are familiar with this shape, mode shape. The first mode, which is having the smallest frequency or the longest period, frequency and period, as you know, are inverse to each other. So the longest period or smallest frequency, that shape characterizes our first mode, and sometimes we also call it fundamental mode, because this is having the maximum contribution. Then the second mode is having one node here where there is no displacement occurring. So this is our second mode, and similarly third mode, and so on. I'm sorry, this shape of third mode is wrong. So third mode will have one more crossing with the zero line. So like that, we will have as many number of modes as the total degrees of freedom, depending on how many nodes we have used to model our structure. then we know the degrees of freedom. So these number of modes will be as many as the degrees of freedom. But it has been seen that as we go for higher modes means that the period is reducing. So the contribution of those modes in the response of the structure goes on reducing. So it is possible that we consider only few modes. We need not to consider all the modes. We consider only few modes, and those few modes can give us reasonably accurate results. And the code suggests that we should consider as many modes which are giving us 90% contribution. So we can calculate the mass participating in each mode, and we combine that mass participation, and that mass participation, if we get equal to 90% of the total mass, so that many modes are enough. The remaining modes we can ignore, because the effort involved in considering those modes is not proportionate to the accuracy we are getting. So while getting the response of this actual structure, we can solve or we can obtain response of a number of single degree freedom systems, and each single degree freedom system corresponds to the different modes which we have obtained. So for example, this single degree freedom system is corresponding to the first mode period, and that period is the longest, so the tallest single degree freedom system we have used here. And then we can get the response directly. For example, if I am considering only one mode, and in some cases if I have a regular bridge, the single mode itself can give us 80 to 90% contribution. So we can get 80 to 90% contribution from the first mode itself. And we can represent this structure by a single mode, single degree of freedom system corresponding to the fundamental mode. And we know response spectrum is giving us the response, peak response of single degree freedom system of a given period. So we can use response spectrum to get the response of this single degree freedom system directly. We can read from here. And that same response we can use as the response of this structure, because this structure we are representing by the single mode single degree freedom system. So sometimes this is also called single mode method, and commonly we know it as equivalent static method. So this equivalent static method is also making use of response spectrum. Sometimes people call it the seismic coefficient method and response spectrum method. That nomenclature is not valid now. Earlier, when the code was having the seismic coefficient method, then that nomenclature was okay. But now even in equivalent static method we are using response spectrum. Only thing is that we are using a single mode, and that period which we are getting in the fundamental mode, that period we are using to get the response, and we get the single response, and that single value of spectral acceleration we multiply by the whole mass. We assume that whole mass of the structure is participating in the fundamental mode itself, and we multiply that mass with this response in the first mode, and that gives us the force acting on the structure. So that is what we call equivalent static analysis. I can extend this to multiple modes. So rather than considering a single mode, I can consider number of modes. If I take all the modes, then this will give me the correct response of the structure. But usually we consider fewer modes, because those fewer modes reduce our computational effort significantly and give us sufficiently accurate results. Now in case of this multi-mode analysis, where I am considering multiple modes, two types of analysis are possible. In one analysis I use the time history. So I can use the same time history which I want my structure to analyze for. So same time history I will apply at the base of all these single degree freedom system, and I will get response of the single degree freedom system with time, and I can simply add this response because I have the full time response, full response for the whole duration of the time. I will simply add those. This method is called response history analysis. This is almost as accurate as the time history analysis. Time history analysis is the most accurate analysis we will discuss in the next slides, where we are analyzing the structure as a whole, the multi-degree freedom system with all its nodes and all its degrees of freedom, we are analyzing for a given time history. So that is our time history analysis. Here what we are simplifying, rather than analyzing the actual structure which is having multiple degrees of freedom, we are analyzing a series of single degree freedom systems for the same time history, and then the response will be, we will be adding. So this is also called a mode superposition method using time history. So here we are doing mode superposition, but we are using time history, and this method is called response history analysis. It reduces the computational effort significantly and gives us quite accurate results. We can further simplify this multimode superposition, that we can use response spectrum in place of time history, because response spectrum gives us the response of single degree freedom system directly. So corresponding to each single degree freedom system, which again corresponds to different modes of the structure. So we can read the response, the peak response of each of these single degree freedom systems directly from the response spectrum. But then when I am reading the peak response, I cannot add those directly, because the peak response of different single degree freedom systems are occurring at different time instants. Those are not occurring at the same time instant, because the response of the single degree freedom system depends on its period. So because the periods of these single degree freedom systems are different, their responses are also going to be different, and not only those are going to be different, the peaks will occur at different time instants. So we cannot add the peak response of these single degree freedom systems directly. We have to use either what we call SRSS, square root of sum of squares, or CQC combination methods. For normal structures, SRSS is good enough. In case of complex structures, irregular structures, we may have to go for CQC. Both these options are available in the software, so we can use any of these combinations. When we are using these combinations, this is also good enough, because we are considering multiple modes. Only in those cases where we cannot get 90% mass participation, considering a reasonable number of modes. For example, this happens in case of cable stayed bridge. So in cable stayed bridges, if we consider even 200 or more than 200 modes, it will be difficult to get 90% mass participation. In that case, this mode superposition method is not going to work. There we have to go for the time history analysis. And what we do in time history analysis, we consider the actual model, including the substructure as well as superstructure. We consider different nodes. We lump the mass at those nodes. We consider stiffness of each element, and then we analyze this full model to the time history. This is called time history analysis, and this is the most rigorous method. We don't have any approximation here, and whatever methods we have discussed, this out of those, this is the most accurate for linear structures. For nonlinear, if I want to consider the nonlinear behavior of the structures, then I have to extend it to nonlinear time history analysis. So nonlinear time history analysis gives us the most realistic response of the structure during earthquake. But if I am not interested in nonlinear analysis, I am considering the effect of nonlinearity indirectly, which we discussed yesterday in the form of response reduction factor, then I can go for this linear or elastic time history analysis, and this is the most accurate among these methods which we have discussed. But there is one problem in time history analysis, and the problem is using the time histories, the selection of the time history. We need time histories to perform this analysis. And as we discussed yesterday, we cannot predict the time history exactly which is going to occur at my site, because all the earthquakes have unique signatures. So the earthquake which will come in future will be different than all those earthquakes which we have recorded in the past. So the earthquake recorded in the future which is going to affect my structure will be different. And due to that reason, one single earthquake may not be good enough. So we have to consider a number of earthquake time histories to analyze my structure, and then take either the envelope response of those or the mean response. If I am using sufficient number of time histories, then I can take the mean response. If I am considering a smaller number of earthquakes, then I have to consider the envelope response. So it is desirable that we perform analysis for 11 time histories, and if we don't want to do for 11 time histories, minimum 3 time histories should be used. If I am using 3 time histories, then the response will be considered as envelope of those 3 time histories. If I am considering 11 time histories, then I can consider the response as the mean of those time histories. And these time histories are to be either obtained from the pool of recorded accelegrams. So there are different websites where earthquakes recorded worldwide are provided. We can select the appropriate earthquake from there. So there has to be a proper selection procedure that requires some skills. If such recorded accelegrams which are representative of my site are not available, then we can go for simulated accelegrams or artificial accelegrams. We can understand these simulated accelegrams or artificial accelegrams. These do not have the natural characteristics. So characteristics may be different. So these are not desirable. Only in special situations where the recorded accelegrams are not available, or the accelegrams which are available are recorded at very different type of sites, what is there, what conditions are there at my site. Only in that case we should go. Otherwise, mostly we use recorded accelegrams. And when we are using recorded accelegrams, recorded earthquakes, then it is not necessary that it represents the response spectrum for which I am designing. So let us say the response spectrum which I want to design for, this is given by the blue color, this is the target spectrum, and what I am getting from the selected ground motion. Even if I have selected ground motions very carefully, taking the magnitude, distance as I am expecting at my site, and also the site conditions, which type of site, what is the thickness of the layers of soils deposited at my site, and what is the stiffness of those sites. Even if I consider all those, it is possible that it will not match with my target spectrum, the design spectrum which I am having. So what I have to do? I have to do scaling, and this scaling we do in time domain. Time domain scaling means that whole of the whole of the recorded time history I am multiplying by a factor. I am scaling the whole time history by one single factor. That preserves its frequency and dynamic characteristics. So if I take that and multiply it by a scale, what factor I should multiply with? One possibility is that I multiply it or I scale it by PGA or EPGA, to be more precise, what we are getting at the 0 period. So if I take that 0 period which I want, or which is there in my target spectrum, and I multiply it by or I scale the ground motion with that, then we can see that it is not necessary that whole of the response spectrum will be matching that with that. So even if I take PGA here, the shape of the response spectra, the two response spectra, the target and what I am getting from the ground motion, both are not same. And even if I scale by any factor, it is not possible to scale the full range of the response spectrum. In that case, which point is more important to us? That point on the response spectrum which is governing the response of my structure, that is more important, and that corresponds to the fundamental period. So if I scale with respect to the fundamental period, the first mode period, that is more important, because this point or this value of spectral acceleration is going to give maximum contribution in my structure. So usually we scale it with respect to this parameter, what we call SAT1. How this scaling is done? That at this fundamental period T1, I will get the value of spectral acceleration from the target response spectrum, and I will get it from the response spectrum of the time history, and then I will multiply the time history in such a way by a factor that this value at T1 becomes same. So this scaling is most commonly used. Although we know that even if we are doing this at other periods, because my structure may be having other higher modes also, so at other periods the spectral acceleration may be different. So this is also not perfect, and any such perfect method by which we can combine, we can retain the natural characteristics of the ground motion, and at the same time we can obtain the response spectrum which I am targeting, is not possible. So we do a compromise where we take or we scale our time histories corresponding to the fundamental period, and at other periods the response spectrum is going to be different. That's why we consider large number of time histories. Some of the time histories will be having a response spectrum above my targeted spectrum, and some of the time histories will be having response spectrum below at every period. And then when I take the mean of those, mean response of those, that is quite good representative of the response corresponding to the response spectrum which I have targeted. So when I consider this is an example where 11 or rather 30 time histories have been taken, and response spectra of individual time histories have been plotted, and let us say the fundamental period of my structure is 1 second. So we can see here original time histories are having a lot of variation here. So it is varying, the spectral acceleration here is varying a lot. What we can do, we scale those in such a way that at 1 second all the time histories now have the same value of spectral acceleration which I had targeted from my target response spectrum. But we can see that at other periods the spectral accelerations are different. But when I will take mean of those, all these response spectra, I can see that that will be quite close to the target response spectrum which I want my structure to design for. Okay. The other thing is the spectral matching. In spectral matching, what we do, we alter the frequency content. That's why it is also called frequency domain spectral matching. So here we are changing the frequency content of the earthquake ground motion, and because we are changing the frequency content, and frequency content is very important for obtaining the response of the structure. So that's why it is not a preferred method. But when the recorded ground motions are not available, or the recorded ground motions are very different than what I am targeting for, in that case we can go for frequency domain spectral matching. So here also we take the recorded earthquake, but that recorded earthquake we change, we modify it in frequency domain so that its response spectrum is close to my target response spectrum. So one example is shown here where one earthquake was obtained from the recorded data set, and then it was scaled or spectral matched with our IS 1893 response spectrum. Okay, now considering these different methods, we have very simple method where we consider one single mode which can be manually applied. So we have a very simple method, and then we have a very complicated method which is time history analysis, where even selection of time histories itself is a skilled job, and then making the 3D model that requires skill. So we have very simple to very sophisticated methods available. Question is which method we should use. So wherever we are having a structure which is simple and it is giving 90% or close to 90% mass participation in the single mode, then we can go for the equivalent static method. Now which structures will have such properties? The structure has to be regular and it should not be very tall, because when we have tall piers, then higher modes will have larger contribution, and in that case the single mode method or equivalent static method will not be valid. Now what is that height? Although it is difficult to say, but the codes define. So if we have a look at this SP 114, there is a detailed guideline available. So in case of simply supported regular bridges, if pier height is up to 30 meter, then we can go for ESAM. So this elastic seismic acceleration method, it is what I called the equivalent static method. So very commonly this is known as equivalent static method or single mode method. So we can use that. But if the height is more than that, then we should go for response spectrum method. Actually both are response spectrum, so it is not a very correct nomenclature that we call it response spectrum. We use response spectrum here also. We should call it mode superposition method using response spectrum. So mode superposition, where we are considering multiple modes, more than one mode. How many? Which are giving us 90% mass participation. Generally 3 to 5 modes are good enough for our normal structures to give 90% mass participations. But if it is very tall or a special type of structures, then even this may not be enough. And if the there is a continuous bridge, then in case of a continuous bridge we have to go for either the mode superposition method using time history or the time history analysis. So here we have to go either mode superposition or we have to go for time history. And if the bridge is curved, then we should go for time history analysis because of two reasons. One reason is that in case of a curved bridge, there are contributions of higher modes. So if the bridge is curved or askew, then its geometry is different. We will get contribution from higher modes. Secondly, we want to predict the pounding and opening. So for predicting that pounding and opening, we should go for 3D analysis. So we should make a complete 3D model. So these guidelines we can use to select different methods. And in case of tall structures, tall bridges, in case of long span bridges, in case of askew and curved bridges, and in case of irregular bridges, we should go for time history analysis, or at least the mode superposition method using either time history or using response spectrum, so that the contribution of higher modes is taken into account. Single mode equivalent static method is not applicable in such cases. Now, the second new concept which has been introduced recently in our course is the capacity design. So what is this capacity design? For explaining that, I will take an analogy. Suppose we have a chain, and in that chain there are several links, and one of those links is ductile. All other links are brittle. So only this dark link, this is ductile, all other links are brittle. So the load displacement behavior for the brittle links are shown here. In case of brittle link, it will be linear elastic behavior, and then suddenly it will fail, it will break. But the ductile link, it will first have a linear elastic behavior, then it will yield, and after yielding it will have a plastic response. Now the question is, if all my links except one are brittle links and only one link is ductile, can I make this chain behave in a ductile manner? Yes, we can. How? I have to only ensure that the strength of the brittle link should be higher than the ductile link, so that when this force is increasing, if I go on increasing this force P, failure will occur somewhere. Question is where that failure is occurring. If that failure is occurring in the ductile link, then the failure will be ductile. What we see here, this is the combined failure, so it will be ductile. Otherwise, if the ductile link is stronger than the other links, then the other links are going to fail first, and in that case the failure of the whole chain is going to be brittle. Now when we talked about RCC structures, we discussed that the concrete is a brittle material, steel is ductile material, and in reinforced concrete we are using both. We try to enhance the ductility of RCC members by designing the members to be under reinforced and enhancing the ductility of concrete as much as possible through confinement. This we have seen. But even with this enhancement, we can make our RCC members ductile only in flexion, only in bending. We can make those ductile. The RCC members in compression will remain brittle. RCC members in shear will remain brittle. And there will be some other components which I cannot make ductile. For example, bearings, especially the metallic bearings which we are using, we cannot make them ductile. So in a bridge there are a number of components. Some of the components we can make ductile. Those are the components where the failure is desirable, or I desire that if the failure occurs, failure should occur in those elements. There are some other elements where we don't want, those are undesirable elements from the point of view of failure. I don't want the failure to occur there, because if the failure occurs in those elements, the failure is going to be brittle. Now how we can achieve this? With this analogy, we can, with this chain analogy, we can easily figure out the method. What I have to do? I have to make all those elements which are undesirable for failure, I have to make those stronger than the ductile members or ductile mode of failure. I need not to make the brittle components stronger than earthquake. That is not required. I need not to make these stronger than force P, because force P is very large. Earthquake force is very large. So we are not making these components stronger than earthquake. We are making these components stronger than the corresponding ductile elements, which are transferring load to these elements. So if I can make those brittle elements or brittle links stronger than the ductile link, then the failure will occur in ductile link, not in the brittle link, and my whole structure will behave in a ductile manner. Now, in case of buildings, there are well established rules like strong column, weak beam. We know that the columns are not as ductile as the beams. The reason is the columns are subjected to axial force also, axial compression also, in addition to bending. And when a member, RCC member, is subjected to axial force, its ductility reduces. So as the axial force increases, the ductility goes on reducing. Till balance failure, from the PM interaction curve, we can see there is some ductility available in RCC members. Beyond balance failure, the ductility reduces drastically. So if the columns are weaker, then the failure will occur in the columns, and in that case the failure is going to be brittle. On the other hand, if the hinges, the columns are stronger than the beams, so we have the well-known principle of a strong column, weak beam. So where we have the strong column, weak beams. Okay, I have received one comment that the voice is breaking. So are you able to hear me? Is there any problem regarding the voice, or is it okay?
No, sir,
I
it
hope
is
it is
it is
working
fine.
fine. Okay.
It's fine.
Okay, yeah, I'm afraid from the yesterday's experience. So there is a principle of strong column, weak beam, and when we make columns stronger than the beam, then the hinges form in beams, and beams are primarily flexural members, and in that case we get larger ductility. And also we can see that if columns of a story are developing the plastic hinges, then we can see that with few columns, or columns of one story itself with few hinges, the whole structure is going to collapse. Whereas when the hinges are forming in beams, a large number of hinges can be sustained before the structure is becoming a mechanism or it is failing. So the second approach is going to give us much better energy dissipation, and it can sustain much larger earthquake as compared to the first case. Now, same thing is not possible in case of a bridge. So if we compare this ductile building frame with bridge, this type of failure is not possible, because we cannot have hinges in our pier cap. So in case of bridges, the hinges occur at the top and bottom of the piers. If it is a framed pier, if we are having multiple column band, then the hinges will form at top and bottom. If it was a single column band, then the hinge will form at the base only. And that's the reason that the energy dissipation in the bridges is going to be much less than that of the properly detailed and designed building. So we can use much larger response reduction factor in case of buildings as compared to bridges. So yesterday we compared the response reduction factors for buildings and bridges, and bridges response reduction factors were much lower. And one reason we discussed there, because this was the number of hinges was less, because it was a determinate structure. Another issue is that because of the compressive force, the ductility of the piers is going to be less as compared to beams, which we are obtaining here. But if we can have a framed pier where there are beams also, and we design that framed pier in such a way that the beams are developing plastic hinges, then we can dissipate large energies even in case of piers. And that's why we recall in case of ASTO, the response reduction factor for columns or piers was much less, but the response reduction factor in case of framed piers was much larger, 5 was given there. So it depends a lot on which member we are allowing to yield and what is the ductility available in that member. Now if I have to ensure that the hinges should form in columns only, not in the other elements, what I have to do? I have to make other elements stronger than the column. The problem with what happens in our design, that usually we over design the columns. We don't want to take risk with piers. So piers we over design, And once we over design the piers, we have to over design all other components, because the other components have to be stronger. Earlier, how the code was dealing with this issue? Earlier, if you remember, the code was giving different response reduction factors for bearing, foundation and piers. Substructure was different, foundation response reduction factor was different, and the response reduction factor used for foundation was smaller. If it was 3-4 columns, for foundation it was 2. And the reason was that we wanted foundation to be stronger than the column. So it was indirectly being ensured that the foundation is stronger. But even if I am using a response reduction factor of 2, let us say for the foundation and 3 for the column, but I over design my columns, which usually happens in our design, that we over design the columns, then what will happen? The foundation, even with that response reduction factor, reduced response reduction factor of 2, may not be stronger than the pier. And in that case, the failure or the plastic hinge formation will not, or the damage will not occur in the pier, it will occur in the foundation. And what about bearings? Because the bearings, what response reduction factor we should use? So earlier there was a difference in the code. Some code was saying that we should use a response reduction factor of 1, or we should use response reduction factor of 2. So this concept where different response reduction factors were given for foundation and for bearings or for superstructure was an old concept. Now we are doing it more directly. What is more directly? This is we are calling capacity design, that we first finalize the design of our piers and then we determine what capacity is actually provided in the piers. And we have to understand that the actual provided capacity is larger than what we are using for design because of 2 reasons. One reason is that I may provide larger reinforcement. Another possibility is that the requirement of the reinforcement from ULS considerations may be smaller, but the SLS may govern design, especially in case of railway bridges. Because one difference you might have noticed between railway bridges and highway bridges, that in railway bridges earthquake is a criteria for SLS also, whereas in highway bridges earthquake is not the criteria for SLS. And in case of railway bridges, in many cases it is the SLS, even for earthquake it is the SLS which is governing the serviceability load condition, limit state, serviceability limit state, that is governing the design. And as a result, the ultimate capacity becomes larger than what is required from the ULS consideration. And even if we are using a reduced response reduction factor, let us say 2 for the foundation, there is no guarantee that foundation is stronger than the pier. So that's why in SP114 now there is a more direct approach, and where we calculate the capacity, the moment we calculate, and that moment capacity we multiply with an over strength factor. That over strength factor takes into account the strain hardening, and we also know that in case of steel as well as in concrete we are using the characteristic strength. The actual strength is higher than or the mean strength is higher than the characteristic strength, because characteristic strength we take corresponding to 95% confidence. So 95% samples are having a strength higher than what we are using in the design. So average strength is going to be higher than that. So to take that into account, we first calculate the capacity here at using the PM interaction curve. We calculate the actual capacity which is obtained from the provided reinforcement, and then we multiply that by a factor, over strength factor of 1.35, and that moment capacity we use to calculate the horizontal force here. So maximum horizontal force which this pier can resist or this pier can generate will be equal to m0 divided by h, where h is the height. So this is what we call capacity shear. So this is the capacity shear which can be generated in any earthquake. If earthquake is stronger than this, then also the shear which can be generated cannot exceed this value of h, because we have not designed our column to take more forces than that. Our pier maximum moment it can take, corresponding to this the value we will get is h, and it is not coming from earthquake, it is coming from the capacity of the pier which we have provided. and that capacity we are using in design. So now when we have calculated this shear force, our bearing should be designed for this shear force, the foundation should also be designed for this shear force, and the pier itself in the shear mode should be designed for this shear, because I told that the piers are, or we can make RCC piers ductile in flexure mode, in bending, but we cannot make these ductile in shear mode. So it has to be stronger in the shear than the corresponding force in the moment. So what we do, we first calculate the provided moment capacity, and then we calculate corresponding to that what is going to be the shear which will be generated in my pier, and then I should design my pier for that generated shear or the capacity shear which I am getting from the overstrength moment, and the reinforcement which I am providing should be enough for that. And we can see that in this type of system, the shear force is going to be constant along the height. So we will need this capacity shear to be satisfied along the height, especially when we are using either the tapered pier. In some cases we use tapered pier, and it happens that the tapered pier fails in shear at the top, because at the top moment is not there. Moment is maximum at the base, at the top the moment is 0. So from moment point of view we don't need that size at the top, but to satisfy the shear force it should be able to take shear force. So for satisfying the shear force or getting the shear force capacity, I need to increase the size and the reinforcement at the top. Now same thing we can extend to multi-column piers. In multi-column piers we will have hinges at top and bottom, and the moment capacity will be generated in the bottom as well as at the top, and the capacity we will get will be equal to, because two columns are there, so 2 and m0 divided by h by 2. Effective height is h by 2, or we can say that the shear force which will develop will be equal to m0 plus m0 divided by h. So this will become 2 m0 divided by h by 2, and here the effective height is h by 2. So these will be subjected to much larger shear force as compared to this cantilever, the corresponding cantilever pier, because the effective height is half. So the shear force here will be double. So we will calculate that shear force, and that shear force will be transferred to the foundation. So foundation should be designed for this shear force. Yesterday somebody asked that what response reduction factor we should use for foundations. Actually we don't need any separate response reduction factor for the foundation, and that's the change made in SP 114. SP 114 no more gives separate response reduction factor for foundations. So response reduction factor is given for piers only, because piers are the elements in the bridges where we are dissipating the energy, where we allow the steel to yield, where we allow the member to get damaged so that it can dissipate the energy, and remaining components are to be designed for the force which can be generated from our design. So if we are over designing our piers, we have to be prepared that we have to over design our foundations also. That's why we insist when we are checking any design that the piers should be designed for maximum utilization ratio possible, provided the SLS requirement is also satisfied. So if we require some reinforcement from the coronal requirement, that much we have to provide, but never provide additional reinforcement unnecessarily. That will increase the demand on the foundation, and if that foundation is not designed properly for that increased demand, then the damage will shift from the pier to the foundation, and foundation damage, neither it will be visible nor it will be possible to repair it. So that has to be avoided. Okay, so here are the steps which we follow in the capacity design. I think I will skip those. I want to show that where common failures have occurred in the past earthquakes. So here we see this failure is this occurred during Bhuj earthquake, and not only in Bhuj earthquake, in all the earthquakes it has been observed that the bearing is the most common failure location. So either the bearing itself fails or the anchorage of the bearing fails. Reason that bearing we do not design for enough force. We have to understand the maximum force which can generate in the bearing depends on the design of the pier. So if we have over designed the pier, the bearing will also has to be over designed for that force. So it should be designed for capacity shear. It has been seen in the past earthquakes. Then shear failure of the pier itself. Just now we discussed that the pier can be made ductile only in flexure. It cannot be made ductile in shear. So if the shear reinforcement is not adequate, then the pier is going to fail in shear mode, and shear mode is brittle, so it will not be able to dissipate much energy. It will not be able to survive the earthquake. And this happened in Kobe earthquake. In Kobe earthquake, another very interesting but unfortunate thing happened. Japanese were very proud of their highways, but Kobe earthquake caused widespread damage to Japanese highways. And there was very simple problem, one very simple problem which was not well understood at that time. And that happened due to the curtailment of the reinforcement in the piers. So we can see that the whole highway lengths are toppled. And if you see in close-up, this was the failure, and you can see these bars are curtailed here, and failure occurred at the location of the curtailment here where the bars were curtailed. Even here we can see in this type of wall type of pier also the bars were curtailed here and failure occurred here where the curtailment is. So what went wrong with the curtailment? Let's understand this. This can be understood from the capacity design principle. So what happens, suppose I have a pier, let us say cantilever pier like we had in this bridge from Kobe earthquake which I have shown. I will get a bending moment diagram like this. So this is our design moment, and when the designer has designed, he will provide reinforcement in such an arrangement that the moment capacity at the base is this much, and at certain height, close to mid height, the curtailment is made, and then the strength will reduce, and you can see that the strength everywhere is more than the design moment. So it is acceptable design, we don't see any problem. But what happens during earthquake? During earthquake, this shear force which will develop here will not be equal to my design shear. It will depend on what capacity can generate here, and the capacity which we are going to get at the base is this much. So shear force will be corresponding to the moment capacity which will develop at the base. So that will give me this force, horizontal force. And then what will be the shape of my moment diagram? Given by this line. So this is the shape of my moment diagram. So that provided moment which was earlier safe with respect to the design moment, now you see what happens here at the curtailment point, it has become unsafe. That's why now both the code discourage curtailment. So in case of short piers, the curtailment should not be done. And the definition of the short pier in IRC is given, in IRS code is given as 30 meter. So in piers less than 30 meter, curtailment should not be done. It should be avoided. And in case of taller piers, where curtailment can give us considerable economy, there we can go for curtailment, but we have to ensure that at the curtailment point this should not happen. The capacity should not fall below this envelope which will actually occur during earthquake. So all these problems are occurring because the actual earthquake force is much larger than what we are designing for, and the behavior of my structure may be very different than what I am obtaining from my linear analysis. So where these things are happening, we have to keep in mind, and capacity design is one technique which tells us this. So this moment diagram we should use to determine the height at which the curtailment is to be done. So if curtailment was shifted upward, perhaps this type of failure would not have happened if this was taken into account. Okay, another failure, this happened because of the splaying of the column at the top. So at the top the column head has been flared, it has been splayed, and what happens due to that? The shear failure occurred. Why the shear failure occurred? You can notice that it is an integral type of bridge. So although there is single single column pier, but it is integral. And what happens in such case? Suppose this I am showing two piers along the length, and because these are integral, so this will act like a frame. So these two piers will act like a frame, and what we will have yielding at the top, yielding at the bottom, and the capacity I can get, the shear capacity or the shear force which will develop, I can get as m naught by h by 2, which will develop in this column. Now if I flare this column up here, then what will happen? Then the hinge, plastic hinge will not form here, because this has become now stronger. Plastic hinge shifts downward. It happens here, and as a result what happens? The effective height h dash, this reduces. Earlier the hinge was forming at the top, now the hinge has shifted, and due to this shifting in the hinge, the effective height has reduced. And when the effective height reduces, the shear force increases, the horizontal force increases, because it is m naught divided by h dash by 2, and we can see that because h dash is less than h, the capital H dash, the horizontal force is now more, and because of this increased horizontal force, the damage occurred at the flaring point. Here the damage occurred because the shear force increased, and the reinforcement, the transverse reinforcement, was not designed for that shear force, that was designed for the normal shear force. Now another issue which we have to keep in mind while doing the capacity design, which is still not dealt with in that detail in both the codes, and that is the shape of the PM interaction curve. So this is the shape of PM interaction curve for columns as we have used in SP16, and same is applicable for our piers also. So for a pier, the axial force and bending moment are related through this type of relationship. Now when I am designing this column, let us say this is the force, axial force, and this is the applied moment mu, and this is the resistance. Usually we keep axial force much lower than the balance force. Reason is that beyond this balance force, if my axial force is more than this, then the failure is going to be brittle. So most of the times the axial force, we select the sizes of the piers in such a way that the axial force is below the balance failure, and we can see here the balance failure, the load is less than the balance failure, and at this load the resistance should be more than the applied moment. So MUR should be larger than MU. So that's what we anticipate. Now what will happen during earthquake? During earthquake, the moment will increase, but not only moment will increase, the axial force will also increase, especially in case of the framed piers. So if I have this type of pier, or I have framed pier, this type of pier, so when the earthquake force is increasing, it is not only increasing the moment. Due to the overturning, the axial force is also increasing, and when the axial force is increasing, what will happen to the moment capacity here? The axial force is increasing, so we can see that the moment capacity is also increasing. So we have to consider this increase in the axial capacity of increase in the moment capacity of the pier due to increased axial force. So we have to use this value of MC. So I should know what axial force will be actually occurring during earthquake in my pier. That can be done. The procedure for that is available in ASTO, so we can do that. So that is an iterative procedure, a simple iterative procedure. We can follow that. We will first assume that there is no axial force due to earthquake, and we will determine what shear force it can take, and we will calculate the moment capacity corresponding to that, and then for this shear force I can calculate how much axial force will be there. Now I will revise the moment capacity corresponding to those axial forces and recalculate the shear force, and within few iterations I can do that. Alternatively, a conservative method. In conservative method, what I should do? I should take the maximum moment capacity which is corresponding to the balance failure. So M balance corresponding to the P balance, that is the maximum moment capacity which can occur in my column. But this may be conservative, because actually my axial force may be somewhere here, and we can see that this balance moment may be much larger than what I am actually going to get even during earthquake. But if I see that my applied axial force is very close to the balance axial force, I can take the maximum moment capacity from the PM interaction as the moment capacity. This is the problem in case of framed piers. In case of cantilever piers, when we are having single pier, single column pier, then this problem is not there, because there the axial force does not depend on earthquake. Earthquake does not increase or decrease the axial force. Axial force comes from the gravity load, the dead load and live load. It does not come from earthquake. But in case of frame piers, the axial force is affected by earthquake also. So we have to keep that also in mind. Okay, so this is from ASTO. So these steps are given in ASTO. I will be sharing the PDF of this PPT in any case, so you can go through that. Now, after this capacity design, I want to discuss some miscellaneous issues which are related to or which we commonly find where there is some misunderstanding and our codes are not very clear. And one such issue is, okay, this is now clear. I should not say that the code is not clear. Now our code, IRS code, is quite clear, and it has been included in SP 114 also for overturning. So earlier code was silent about this, and many of our old designs may be unsafe from the point of view of overturning of the superstructure. So superstructure itself can overturn, because the earthquake force, when it is applied, it will be applied at the center of mass. So at the center of mass of the superstructure, we will have a horizontal component in the transverse direction, which is arising because of the mass of the superstructure. Then above that there is also live load, and at the center of the mass of the live load also there will be a horizontal force. This horizontal force will cause overturning moment, and this is combined with vertical component of earthquake. So we discussed that vertical component of earthquake is there in all the cases, although vertical component is 2/3 of the horizontal component, and when we are combining with the horizontal component, we will consider 30%, because the peak vertical and peak horizontal forces will not occur together. So we will take 30% of the vertical component, 100% of the horizontal component, and then we have to find out the forces, the net forces which will be developing in these bearings. And if the forces developing due to bearings, developing in the bearings due to this overturning exceed the vertical downward forces due to dead load and live load, then overturning will occur. And we have to provide appropriate arrangement, holding down devices for these, to avoid this type of overturning. So if I am having a multi girder superstructure, wide superstructure for several tracks, then perhaps this situation may not arise. But in case of twin girder superstructures, this situation will commonly arise, where I will get uplift at one of the bearings. So I have to either design the bearing to take care of that uplift, or I have to provide a holding down device similar to that. And the code gave detailed guidelines. Both codes have the same guidelines, in fact, IRS as well as SP 114. And it is to be designed, the vertical force, upward force is to be calculated for horizontal and vertical component of the earthquake with R is equal to 1. Elastic forces. Code says that this is to be done for elastic forces. So R is equal to 1. I fully could not get the logic for using R is equal to 1, but what I guess is that perhaps it is to take into account the capacity effect, because the actual capacity of the pier may be larger. So we, in reality, I mean, in my opinion, it should have been calculated based on the capacity shear, but the code says that it should be calculated for R is equal to 1, and that force we will use to calculate the overturning. So we calculate that overturning force U and compare it with the downward force D due to dead load. What codes say that we have to consider dead load. Now it is not clear whether the earthquake force we should consider for live load and dead load both, or the earthquake force should also be calculated for dead load alone. in my opinion, the earthquake force should be calculated, the overturning force should be calculated due to dead load and live load both, because at the time of earthquake there is a possibility that train may also be there on the bridge, and because of the train, the horizontal force acting on the train, and the CG of the train is quite high above the bearings, there will be significant overturning effect. So to take care of that, we should calculate earthquake force due to dead load as well as live load. Now regarding the restoring force, the code says that we have to consider only dead load. So that we cannot overrule. I am not very sure what will happen, why the live load is not considered for calculating the downward load. Maybe somebody who is familiar with this original formulation may perhaps educate, but what I feel is that the horizontal force should be taken, horizontal and vertical earthquake force should be considered for dead load as well as live load, and it will be conservative in any case if we are considering the downward force due to dead load alone, and if that downward the upward force is exceeding 50% of the capacity, 50% of the downward force, then we have to design for vertical hold down devices. So if U is more than 0.5 D, U is upward force due to overturning and vertical component of earthquake, and D is the downward force due to dead load. So if this is more than 50%, then we have to design, we have to provide the vertical hold down device, and if U, the upward force, is less than the full D, full dead load reaction, then we need to design the holding down device for 10% of D. What is this condition giving? This condition is giving that actually there is no uplift because still U is less than D. But for any eventuality in which the earthquake, the actual earthquake which may be coming will be, and in all the cases, in all probabilities, it will be more than what I am designing for. So to take care of that eventuality, minimum this much holding down force is to be provided to avoid overturning. And if it exceeds D, then we have to design for 1.2 times U minus D. And while calculating, while designing the bearings, we have to take these conditions. Code also says that while calculating U, we have to take the combinations. So these combinations we have to take. D, my interpretation is that in that case we have to put 0.9 D, because restoring force, for the purpose of safety, the restoring force should be underestimated. So D is the restoring force here. So that the factor which we have to use at D is 0.9. So we should use these load combinations for designing the holding down devices. In case we are using bearing to resist this vertical upward force, then in that case, in any case, we are using load combinations as per IRS seismic design code, and there this load combination in any case will come into picture. In IRS, there are some diagrams given, typical holding down devices, how we can provide these holding down devices. Several arrangements for holding down devices are possible. The other issue which have been observed in the past is the unseating of the superstructure, because what happens, the superstructure or the top of the substructure moves more than what we have estimated. It can happen due to many reasons, and one possible reason is liquefaction. Suppose liquefaction occurs on our bridge, which will be usually on a river where the situation of liquefaction are there. So in that case, our soil will become even more flexible, and we have seen that due to flexibility of the soil, the movement at the top of the pier is going to increase, and if that movement exceeds the seat width, then the superstructure may fall down, and if the superstructure falls down like this, it becomes very difficult to restore it in the original position. Even if our bearings have failed, we can replace the bearings, or perhaps we can do some repair, but putting back the superstructure will become very difficult. So this has to be avoided, that it should not fall. And moreover, if some traffic was there on the bridge, this type of failure would have caused more life loss. So this type of failure is to be avoided. And what we can do to avoid this, first of all, we should provide adequate seat width. So all the codes provide formulae for calculation of the seat width as per our IRS seismic code. This is the formula. IRS bridge rules interestingly have a more stringent formula. I'm not sure what is the official position, whether IRS seismic code will overrule this, and if it overrules, then we have to follow this. Otherwise, it is the IRS bridge rules which is following or which is governing the design. In this case, the seat width calculation, these factors are more or less same, length factor and height factor, but the minimum seat width, this is more. In ASTO, it is like this. This is in inches. That's why you see the factors are very different. So here the L and H are in feet, and the seat width is in inch. And here, in addition to length and height, skew angle is also included. In case of skew bridges or curved bridges, the seat length is to be more, because we discussed in the beginning of today's talk that skew bridges and curved bridges will open out at one end and will close and cause pounding on the other end. So to accommodate that opening, we have to enlarge the seat width in case of skew and curved bridges. In case of SP 114, there is a calculation given for the seat width which depends on the calculation of the displacement under earthquake situation. So alternatively, we can use this relationship also. Then these is the other possibility, or rather another additional safety against this unseating, because unseating is a difficult situation which we want to avoid, and it can be avoided easily by providing second line of defense or an arrangement of stoppers and restrainers. So now both the codes are talking about provision for stoppers and restrainers, and we should make it a practice as a habit that in all bridges we should provide these stoppers or restrainers. So these stoppers and the restrainers are to be designed not only for the forces which will be coming, but also the impact, because during earthquake the superstructure will be hitting these restrainers and stoppers. That's why the code says that these are to be designed for 2 times the force used for designing the bearings. So whatever force we are using for design of bearings, 2 times of that we should use for design of these stoppers. And these stoppers can be designed as corbels, because these are small projections projecting out from the pier cap, and we all may have seen or may see it in different books. It is given. I have just taken this figure from B.K. Rena's handbook, where the procedure to design corbel is given. So that procedure we can follow, and these can be easily designed. It is possible to design those. Some other arrangements, different types of arrangements we can think of. The idea is that we have to avoid unseating and we have to avoid overturning. So different holding down and stopper devices we can think of, different arrangements. Okay. The next issue which I want to discuss, on which our codes are not that clear, it is design of retaining walls and abutments. So when we are designing an abutment or retaining wall, the behavior of the two is very similar. Only difference is that in case of abutment, we are having the forces coming from the superstructure also. The inertia force if we have a pinned bearing, or the friction force if we have a roller bearing, that is also coming, and the vertical load is also coming. So when we are designing a retaining wall, it is subjected to its own weight, and at the same time it is subjected to earth pressure. And when we are considering or we are designing the shear wall in a seismic region, in whole of the country is a seismic region in our case, so we have to consider the dynamic earth pressure. So we have to consider the dynamic earth pressure. Then in addition to that, we have to consider the inertia force. This is important. inertia force of the wall itself, including its foundation, so that inertia force, and inertia force of this soil which is resting over the top of this footing. Most of the times the designers skip that. They don't try to take this into account. They try to skip this because this is causing a lot of inertia force on our system. Now the soil which is resting directly above the foundation of my retaining wall or the abutment, that will transfer its inertia force to the foundation. Interestingly, what ASTO says that the soil here and this wall, these will be vibrating in phase. So this force I need not to apply on this wall. So while designing this wall, I need not to consider the inertia force of the soil. But while considering the stability of the foundation or while designing the foundation, at that time it is important to consider this inertia force, Kh into Ws. Kh into Ww, which is because of the concrete portion of the return wall, that is to be considered in all the cases. So the forces, to summarize, what forces we have to consider? We have to consider the inertia force of the wall itself, including its foundation. We have to consider the inertia force of the soil which is resting over the foundation. We have to consider the static earth pressure. We have to consider the dynamic increment in the earth pressure. And if there is any surcharge, then we have to consider not only the earth pressure due to surcharge, we have to also consider inertia force due to surcharge. I came across one interesting example where a return wall or a retaining wall was supporting a drain above this. So a RCC drain was there, and that drain was designed again to retain some soil. So that soil was supporting its, was transferring its forces to the drain, and then this retaining wall was designed only for this force and the vertical pressure which was coming. But where will that horizontal force go which is coming on the drain? That will also be registered by this also. So not only the surcharge effect of this surcharge, the pressure, earth pressure, the inertia force which will be caused due to the earthquake motion, that also needs to be considered while designing this. So these forces we have to understand, we have to consider those. Now ASTO says that this passive pressure which will generate here, we should not take into account because it is not reliable. But our code, IRS code, says that we can take passive pressure into account, but it is limited to 1/3 of the actual passive pressure. Actually, what happens during earthquake, how the return wall or abutment is going to dissipate the energy. Here the hinging is not occurring. It is different than our conventional pier or even wall, because even if we are doing this abutment, there will be return walls. Those return walls can be monolithic, and in that case hinging is not possible. And we do not want here in the wall, we don't want the hinges to, plastic hinge to occur, because if the plastic hinge occurs there, because if this lateral force continuously acting lateral force, it will fail. Okay, earthquake, we allow the hinging to take place in earthquake, but it should not lose its capacity to resist the permanent loads. So here, if this gets damaged during earthquake, it will lose its capacity to resist the earth pressure from this side. So we don't want any hinging to take place in case of an abutment or a return wall. But still it can dissipate energy. And how it dissipates energy? Through sliding. So it slides, and when it slides, then the active earth pressure generates. We know if it is not sliding at all, then the earth pressure is going to be much larger than active. Then the earth pressure at rest will act. But when it slides, then active earth pressure will act. So active earth pressure will act and it will slide. And here from this side, the passive earth pressure will mobilize. And we design our return wall in such a way that it should slide, but it should not overturn, because if it is overturning, it will fail. So that's why we keep the factor of safety in overturning larger than the factor of safety in sliding. So in normal conditions, we use the factor of safety in sliding, if I remember correctly, 1.5 and 2 in overturning. Under earthquake, we reduce the factor of safety in sliding to 1.2 and overturning to 1.5. But the factor of safety in overturning is always larger than the factor of safety in overturning. This is to ensure that during earthquake, my wall should slide. It should not overturn. It should not get damaged in concrete, but it can dissipate energy by sliding. So that behavior we have to ensure. Now the displacement which will occur to mobilize the active earth pressure is much less than the displacement which will be required to mobilize the passive earth pressure. So on the toe side, the soil may not be compacted that nicely, and it will require significant movement before the passive pressure can develop. That's why the codes do not allow consideration of the passive pressure, and even if the passive pressure is to be considered, that is limited to 1/3. And we should be prepared if we are designing our retaining walls and abutments using this method, where the dynamic earth pressure is used or is calculated using Mononabe or Kabe equation, which are given in our code. So those equations have been seen to safeguard our abutments and retaining walls during earthquake, but some sliding is expected. And ASTO clearly says that if we are using this method which is given in our code, then we should be willing to accept up to 8 inches displacement during earthquake. So if the design earthquake will occur, then we are expecting about 8 inches displacement if we are following the method given in our codes, and that too considering the inertia force and everything, then only. Otherwise, if we are not, if we think that we are over designing and we skip, most of the designers I have seen in practice, they try to skip this, and they even quarrel on this, that this is not needed. Why we should take this inertia force? If we are doing that, then our retaining wall and the abutment is not going to be safe during earthquake. So this aspect perhaps will be dealt with in more clarity in the coming revisions of the code. Okay, so same thing is applicable to abutments. The difference in abutment is that a vertical load and also a horizontal force will come from the superstructure. So this additional force will come from the superstructure. Now one more issue here is that for calculating the force, what value of period and response reduction factor we should use. Actually, this concept of period and response reduction factor, SAYG and response reduction factor, this is not applicable in case of retaining walls and abutments. It is not actually a vibration problem. It is a wave propagation problem, and when the wave gets reflected from this wall, it causes a force. That force can be estimated approximately through this Mononabe equation which is given there. If we use the value of acceleration kh or alpha h there as z/2, or what is z there? Z is what we are expecting at the top. So if we use that, the acceleration which we are expecting at the top, which we can consider as the acceleration or the EPGA which will occur on the soil surface. So if we take that z, half of that we use in the Mononabe equation, that will give us the displacement of the order of 8 inches when this wall will be subjected to the design earthquake force. So that's how it is done. So the value of AH used in design of abutments and retaining walls should be equal to z/2 into I. No SAYG, no R. Some of the codes, they give SAYG equal to 1 and R is equal to also 1, or SAYG equal to 2.5, R is equal to also 2.5. Although it is misleading, but the results we get is correct, because SAYG and R cancel out each other. So we get z/2 into I, but actually SAYG and R theoretically, conceptually are not valid here, because we are not having any energy dissipation through yielding in the wall. We are getting it through sliding, and it is not really a vibration problem where the wall will be vibrating in a manner like the piers, because it is retaining soil on the other side. So that type of vibrations are not possible here. Rather, it will act as a boundary in the soil, and the wave which is propagating in the soil will get reflected from this, and that phenomena we need to consider. Okay, so here the steps in the design of these retaining wall and abutments are listed. Another issue which we came across in designing bridges in hilly areas, and that issue is the stability of the abutment in the transverse direction. So far we are considering the stability of the abutment in the longitudinal direction, but it is possible in hilly areas that on one side the abutment is retaining soil to a larger height, on the other side, because it is located on the slope, and the slope can be in both the directions, in longitudinal direction as well as in the transverse direction. So here it is possible that a net force will act on the abutment in transverse direction also. So here we need to check the stability of the abutment not only in longitudinal direction, in transverse direction also. And there are other problems also, which other peculiar issues which we have in case of bridge designing in hilly areas regarding the bearing capacity itself. Bearing capacity on a slope is not same as we obtain on a flat area. So there are other issues also in hilly regions, but this one I wanted to highlight here. Maybe in some other talk we will talk about the specific issues of hilly regions separately. Then one more thing I wanted to discuss, that is the designing RCC components using finite element analysis. So many times what we do for modeling the foundation or modeling the abutment or modeling the superstructure, we use shell element. And shell element, if we look at the stress resultants, it gives us not only moment but it gives us a torsional component also. For example, here in this case, one moment is mxx and another moment is mxy. On each phase at any point we will get two moments, mxx and mxy in this direction. Similarly, in the other direction we will get myy and mxy. Now mxx is the moment and mxy is the torsion. But when we are designing these RCC flat elements, either wall or slab, we are providing reinforcement for moment only. And in many cases what we do, we ignore mxy. That is on non-conservative side. So we have to consider this moment also, the torsional moment also in designing. And some of you may be already knowing, there is a method, a famous method, wood armor method, to consider the torsional component also. I just wanted to highlight, it is simple, we have to just consider the torsional component also. I just wanted to underline that whenever you are using finite element for designing RCC components, please be careful, do not ignore the torsion, because that may make our structure unsafe. Okay. Then designing of foundations for two-way punching. Okay, this is another issue which is not properly or in full detail given in our codes. The railway code talks about punching, but it does not talk about moment, because usually our piers, when those will be supported on foundations, will not only having vertical load, those will also be having moment. On the other hand, the IRC code considers moment and tells how we can calculate the capacity in punching shear when we are considering the moment. That procedure is given, taken from Eurocode, that is there. But suppose under the combined effect of moment and vertical load will cause punching shear, which we all are familiar. Moment will also cause punching shear, that will be reversed in direction. Due to this moment, on one direction the punching shear will be, let us say, upward, on the other direction the punching shear will be downward. So this increased punching shear due to moment we need to take into account. And IRC 112 gives the procedure how we can take that into account through the use of this factor beta. So for different conditions, this beta factor is given in IRC 112, we can take from there. But suppose it is not safe, then how to provide the reinforcement? That is not clear in the codes. So the reinforcement calculation and checking for punching is different. It is not the way we check the reinforcement or the same formula which we use for checking the shear or for calculating the shear reinforcement in case of one-way shear. Same formula, same method of reinforcement is not valid in case of punching shear failure. In punching shear failure, the reinforcement is to be considered along perimeter. So different perimeters, the reinforcement is to be checked. So every perimeter is to be checked, and the reinforcement which is coming on this perimeter, that reinforcement is to be considered. How? Different types of reinforcement arrangements for punching shear may be like this. So actually these arrangements are suggested in Eurocode and also included in ACI 318 for flat slabs. So flat slabs are nothing but like inverted foundation, or foundation is like inverted flat slab. So both undergo punching shear failure, and we have, if those are not safe in punching shear, we have to provide reinforcement. So these are some of the reinforcement patterns. In case of foundations, we may require the shear reinforcement already in terms of, because of the one-way shear, the shear reinforcement may be required. That reinforcement can be considered for checking or satisfying the punching shear, but we have to consider the reinforcement along perimeter, and we can use the Eurocode or ACI 318. There the procedure is given how we can consider it. Okay. Other common problem is about the hollow circular RC piers. So in case of hollow circular RC piers, all the codes including ASTO and Eurocode also are silent, that how these should be designed for shear. For example, moment capacity we can calculate, we know the same formulation is valid for hollow sections also. So moment calculation is not that difficult, but how we should calculate the shear capacity of a hollow section, that is not very clear in the codes. And when we are designing for hollow shear, most of the times I have seen that the designers consider the equivalent solid square area and use that for the designing. That is not correct. That should not be used. So the one paper I could find published by Priestley, we all know Priestley, so it is from Priestley, so we can be confident about its authenticity. It was published in 12th World Conference. After that, in journal also I could not find any other paper, and there they have explained that how the hollow circular RCC section should be designed. So they have come out with this empirical formula, the total capacity because of the concrete capacity, contribution from steel and contribution from axial force, and then expressions are given for different contributions, and that we can use to calculate the capacity of the circular or shear capacity of hollow circular sections. Considering equivalent solid section is not the correct way. It should not be done using that. Then these were the some of the issues which are missing or which needed some emphasis. So I tried to underline those. Then there are few new things which have come in our codes or are in the process of being adopted in the code, and one such thing is pushover analysis. This is a topic in itself, and we can have a separate discussion on this topic. So what is this pushover analysis? Pushover analysis is the simplest method of nonlinear analysis. So that's why there is so much hype about pushover analysis, because it is very easy. Like our equivalent static method, which was very easy for linear systems, the pushover analysis is equivalent of that for nonlinear structures. And what we do in pushover analysis, we apply a load, and this load can have any arbitrary value, but its variation should be proportional to the fundamental mode. So suppose I have made a model where there was only one mass here. I have considered only two nodes, one at the bottom, at the top. Then the fundamental mode will give me only one displacement here. So it will be proportional to that displacement or any value of load I can take. If I have considered multiple nodes here, or my structure is complex, I have considered superstructure also, then I will get the mode shape. So this load has to be applied in proportional to the fundamental mode, and then we gradually go on increasing this load, and then we plot a curve between the load and the displacement. Then we get a curve like this, and this curve we call capacity curve. So this capacity curve is signature of our structure, signature of our bridge. Like we talked about signature of the earthquake, so that time history or response spectrum is signature of the demand. This is the signature of the structure or the capacity of the structure. It is representing three properties. What are those three properties? It is representing stiffness. If I take slope of the initial portion, that gives me the stiffness of my structure. Then the peak value is giving me the strength, and when I do equivalent bilinear idealization of this, I can calculate ductility. So this capacity curve is including all the three concerned properties of the structure, that is stiffness, strength and ductility. That's why we call it as the signature or characteristic of the structure. So this is characteristic of the structure, and response spectrum is the characteristic of the earthquake, and we have to compare these two. So I have to compare the demand with the capacity. Capacity is coming from this pushover analysis, where I am gradually increasing the force and determining when my first rod is yielding, when my concrete stress strain curve of concrete is followed, and I can get the load displacement curve. And that load displacement curve, which we call as capacity curve, it is representing the capacity of the structure. On the other hand, this is the response spectrum in blue curve, that is the demand, and we have to match the demand and capacity. There is only one problem here, and the problem is that in the capacity curve, the equivalent damping is changing with displacement, because we can see when we were talking about the hysteretic energy dissipation, then the energy dissipation changes with displacement, and that energy dissipation we can represent by equivalent damping. So equivalent damping is changing, whereas the response spectrum is for a given damping. It may be for 5% damping, it may be for 10, 20, 30, any damping, but it is for a constant damping. So what we have to do, we have to calculate damping, equivalent damping corresponding to each displacement of my structure, of my capacity curve, and then I have to reduce the demand corresponding to that damping. And when I get an intersection of the demand and capacity in such a way that it is satisfying damping ratio of both the damping of my capacity or structure and the damping which I have used in reducing this response spectrum, both are same at this point, then this point we call performance point, and this point gives us the displacement which will actually occur during earthquake. And once I know this displacement, I get the response of my structure. I know how much will be the ductility demand. I know how much will be the plastic deformation. Plastic deformation can be related with the damage. So I know how much or what type of damage will occur at this point. And most importantly, whether my structure will be able to survive that earthquake or not. Suppose even with the damping which I have here at the extreme point, my reduced demand curve and the capacity curve do not intersect. That means that my structure is not going to survive this particular earthquake, for this response spectrum is given here. So this is the method in which I can determine the real performance of my structure during earthquake. And it is a very simple method, I mean, as compared to the nonlinear time history analysis. It is very simple in comparison to that. That's why it is becoming popular in the design offices, and our codes are also in process of adopting this. Both building code and the bridge codes are talking about this. The other future trend is base isolation, although it is quite old thing worldwide if we see, but was more popular in Japan and New Zealand and of course US, but now it is becoming or maybe popular in coming years in our country also. So here it works on the flexibility of the structure. So we make the structure flexible. So when we make the structure flexible, what happens? The superstructure remains in its place, whereas the ground moves. So if I make my substructure so flexible, then it may so happen that the superstructure does not move at all, and it is only the ground which is moving. And how I can make the substructure so flexible? If I use a special type of bearings which are very flexible, and one such bearing we have seen is elastomeric bearing, and similar bearings, other bearings also, we can have a sliding type of bearing. In that sliding type of bearing, if I have slider at both the ends, what will happen to the superstructure? Superstructure will simply slide, and the flexibility of the substructure including bearings will be much larger. And due to that flexibility, the acceleration, this we see from the shape of the response spectrum, we have seen that the acceleration and hence the force will reduce significantly. So we get that advantage that the force will reduce. So I have to design my superstructure for much lower earthquake force, and I have to design my substructure and foundation for much less force, because the SAYG value will reduce due to increased period. But there is a problem, and that problem is that with this increased flexibility, increased period, the displacement goes on increasing. The earthquake force is reducing, but displacement is still increasing. This we have seen from the shape of the displacement spectrum and the acceleration spectrum. So that is the nature of the earthquake action, that the force may reduce, but the displacement still increases, and we have to take care of this displacement. We can take care of this displacement either design our bearings that way or by providing damping. Now what does damping do? Here I have shown the effect of this period shift. So if I use flexible bearing, so base isolation is nothing but use of some type of flexible bearing. And with that flexible bearing, suppose originally the period of my structure, my bridge was 0.5 second, I change it to 2 seconds. So you can see that it will reduce to, here it was close to 1.8, let us say, here it is 0.6. So the force will be reduced to 1/3. So that type of reduction I will get. But the displacement will increase, and to take care of that displacement, I have to use the damping. So see here, 0.5 original, the displacement was this much. Now the displacement is much larger. So displacement has increased several times, more than 4 times in this case. So earthquake force has reduced to 1/3, but the displacement has increased 5 times. So that displacement may be a problem, and I have to take care of that. And for that, we can use dampers. We can use dampers otherwise also. So just I wanted to show you some photographs where these dampers have been implemented. So some of the bridges, these dampers have been implemented, and these dampers have both the advantages. It not only reduces the displacement, it reduces the force also, because damper is not changing the period. Let us say period remains same, but still with increased damping, the SAYG value is reducing. So it is reducing the force, and at the same time it is also reducing the displacement. At same given period, increased damping, the response, even the displacement response spectrum reduces. So damper has the advantage that it is reducing both force as well as displacement. That's why the damper appears to be a more reliable technique as compared to base isolation, because in base isolation there is additional problem. I have to keep a very skilled view of the site specific response spectrum. I have to keep that in mind. If by chance the peak of my response spectrum is occurring at 2 seconds, then the base isolation will not work. It will rather worsen the performance of the bridge. But damper will work in any case. So it will work irrespective of what is the period, and it is not increasing the displacement, rather it is decreasing the displacement also. So we can use dampers more reliably with more confidence. Okay, so thank you. That's all I wanted to discuss for today. Okay, so you must have sent the questions. I will stop sharing, and I hand over to Mr. Verma how to conduct further. Should we stop here or we want to take a few questions?
Thank you very much, sir, for such a nice, knowledgeable, and insightful lecture. We are all blessed to have you on this lecture. And one quick question, sir, from my side. In IRS seismic code, for consideration of vertical component of seismic forces, so we have kept it open, like we say that it should be considered for larger spans. We have not defined any limit in meters and all. What do other codes say about it? Do they try to define this for a particular hex meters? What do other codes say about it?
Okay. Historically, earlier the courts were separating the cases in which the vertical component of earthquake should be considered, and which cases there is no need. It is not that it should not be considered, there is no need. That means this is not significant. We can ignore it. Now because we are using softwares, earlier we were doing manual calculations, so considering vertical component meant additional effort. Now we are using software, so vertical component can be used very easily. So what is recommended now in most of the courts is that in all the cases we should consider all the components of earthquake. We should consider 100, 30, 30, X, Y and Z in all the cases. Wherever it will be insignificant, it will not govern our design, but it is not going to cause any harm. But some of the cases we have to be very, very careful, like the pre-stressed long span bridge, cable stayed bridge. If it is a curved bridge, because there is an eccentricity, and that eccentricity we consider in dead load and live load. But when vertical component of earthquake is acting on dead load and live load, that will also have eccentricity. So those cases we have to be very careful. There we cannot ignore in any case. So those conditions may be given by the courts, that where it is extremely important, but there is no harm. We can have this view that vertical component of earthquake should be considered in all the cases. So wherever it will be significant, it will be automatically come as significant. Where it is insignificant, it will not affect our design.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, sir. As sir has told yesterday that all the questions which have been typed in into the chat, a written answer to those would be prepared and it would be published on a website, and the link will be shared with all the participants on their given email IDs. So for today's question as well, the same system shall be followed. All the questions today also and yesterday's also. Both would be compiled, answers would be provided in writing, and those will be shared with all the participants for mutual benefits of all. And what else? I think the link can be shared so everybody will be having access to those. And I don't think anything else is left. Thank you very much, sir, for giving us this wonderful, nice, insightful session. We would like to collaborate with IIT Roorkee more and more for conducting sessions, and it is in the benefit of everyone. And I would like to request Mr. Kavan to keep this open, the chat section open for 5 to 10 minutes more, so that if somebody is having some question, they can formulate them and they can type them into the chat box.
Okay.
So that everybody gets that opportunity. Please keep the chat thing open for at least 5 to 10 minutes more. So thank you very much. With your permission, we would like to close this session. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending, being with us this afternoon, and thank you RDSO for this nice collaboration. Because of COVID, our collaboration did not went last 1 year in that full swing as we wanted, but hopefully now this will improve. So thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.